Hello and welcome to a very interesting paper that, although short, is both highly relevant and very recent. It's an interesting look at Chinese gaming industry through the Japanese eyes, especially because in the last 2 decades it seems like China has overtaken Japan in the large global market share. Um, the paper was published in Quarterly Journal of Marketing in 2025 and is authored by Jin Takahashi and Furukawa. It was originally written in Japanese, but for mortals like me and some of you, it has been translated into English. It gives a brief history of the Chinese gaming industry using macro, meso, and analytical framework, insights from Japan's perspective. We'll begin with looking at history and policy drivers of the success in the industry, and then come back to examining how the researchers use the framework so that it can be useful to future researchers and policymakers. So let's begin with the history of Chinese industry. Um, Chinese gaming industry actually emerged in, say, early 1980s, but it really didn't become a big thing and become into the global market until, say, the end of 1990s. And it began with, the after economic reforms in 1980, with arcade and console culture that entered via Hong Kong and Taiwan. At the time, pirated foreign games were dominating because there was not enough PC access in the country, although they were quite popular in internet cafes. Because of China's size, it's always had a major gaming domestic market, and but it did not enter the market like global market until the early 2000s. But by late 2010s, Chinese companies had expanded aggressively overseas, and presently they compete with global players like that of the US and are ahead of Japan. In fact, because of the wide use of smartphones, along with innovations in gaming technology and internet technology, the domestic market in China increased rapidly. So much so that the market size has reached as high as 210 billion in 2023. And according to Sensor Tower, it says that 40 Chinese companies are currently among the world's top 100 mobile game publishers. So, some important aspects about China, since it views gaming as a part of cultural and ideological influence, game production and distribution are highly regulated. And while they're also supporting the game industry through policies since early 2000s, political content, violent gambling, and sexuality are strictly censored in the country. So there is both regulation and policy support. In 2000, due to the concerns about impact of gaming on minors, the government banned consoles and tightly regulated arcades, which actually shrank the market for some time and isolated China's gaming industry. But until say about 2013. But by late 2010s, with broadband growth, companies like Tencent and NetEase expanded into online gaming, and that was followed by rapid growth in mobile gaming, driven by smartphone and digital payments. Another roadblock was license freeze, which happened, sometime in 2018, and there was a lull because from the strict regulations, including the freezes and the limitations on minors' playtime, stalled the domestic growth market. But what happened because of that was that the local companies, domestic companies, started to look at markets outside of China that wouldn't have so many restrictions. So now we start to look at different things that actually supported China's growth in the gaming industry. Despite all the setbacks, there were some key reasons behind its fast success, and one was government policy. The Chinese government active support through regulation, funding, strategic direction. All of that helped the industry because it through subsidies, tax incentives, and infrastructure development. The second thing was that something that we've already talked about, that China already had a large domestic market. That was a huge advantage and allowed China to quickly test and refine their own products, domestically before they could go global. So they had enough people to test them at home to ensure that the products will be successful globally. So the third one is that there's strong capabilities in mobile and first game design and monetization strategies within the Chinese system. They develop these systems such as free to play and models with in-game purchases that allowed the domestic industry to grow, but also it sort of favored people from outside to be purchasing Chinese games. Finally, overall, Chinese government invested heavily in global publishing partnerships and acquisitions, which actually, supported their international expansion. So, as we talked about, free-to-play models and with game purchases, all of this influenced Chinese market abroad. So now, as we wrap up the paper, we will look at how this paper was analyzed, how did they come up to these conclusions, and this will be helpful for anybody who wants to use a similar research or for policymakers if they want to go back and apply the same model to other countries. So here's a brief look at the analytical framework. It was the global competitiveness that the Japanese authors were looking at, was shaped at macro, meso, and micro level. At macro level, the focus was on national, what are the national policies that China was looking at and the broader economic environment that was provided. China's game market is huge, as we talked about, but it also helped companies grow strong quickly despite unstable government because there was a huge market within the country. China overtook Japan in mobile graphics and cross-platform development. Despite the government restriction, but because their own domestic market allowed them testing. Then we come to the meso level, which is analysis looked at the industry itself and the structure and the network and the ecosystems. China had a huge R&D and talent development that they had developed, and private firms were helping global expansion because they understood that there were a lot of restrictions at home, and so they started to look at countries where the restrictions were not so many and that they could sell their games. Finally, at the micro level, the scholars looked at individual companies and strategies and innovation. And this was quite interesting because they said, first of all, they followed an agile development model, which allows for quick updates. They also had cross-platform strategy, which allowed them to reach more players efficiently. And unlike Japan, there was a little hierarchy. Therefore, developers and publishers were more equal, and it allowed for faster and more flexible decision making because nobody was waiting for seniors to make decisions. Another strategy, this was very interesting at micro level, was that Chinese firms were interested in mainly hiring young people who would become leaders in their 30s and 40s. They were mostly gamers themselves, but even if they were not gamers, the quick turnaround within the company and the fast work culture allow them to learn very quickly. So this layered approach helps explain why Chinese gaming industry exploded in the last 2 decades. So, from Japan's perspective, Japan's traditionally been a global leader in gaming industry, and but this comparison, they actually said that Chinese success is not accidental. They actually worked on it. It was both aggressive and adaptable. They started to look at what was not allowed at home, what were their strengths, and how to then use government support, market scale, and apply their technological adaptation and strategically expand globally. The authors gave a neutral nod to the future, stating that China's game industry will likely continue to expand globally. But with regulatory restrictions, there might be some stalling of the industry as has happened before. But then, even then, Japan says that they have a lot to learn from China and they should rethink some of their own strategies. Um, Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please.